A billionaire CEO is stunned to find a little boy asleep in his office, before freezing in shock when he realizes the child is clutching an old photo of him and his first love. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Robert Pattinson stepped into his dimly lit office, loosening the tie he had barely tolerated wearing all evening. The gala had been tedious as usual, an endless stream of forced smiles, handshakes, and empty pleasantries from people who wanted something from him. He was used to it. It was the price of success. But at least now, he could retreat into his sanctuary, enjoy a rare moment of solitude before heading home. Or so he thought. The sight on his sleek leather couch made him stop in his tracks. A small figure lay curled up, tangled in an oversized hoodie, fast asleep. For a moment, Robert wondered if exhaustion was finally making him hallucinate. He had no idea how a child had gotten past security and into the highest floor of Pattinson Enterprises, but there he was, as real as the city skyline beyond the massive glass windows. Robert stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning the boy. He couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, his messy brown hair sticking up at odd angles as if he'd been running his hands through it. His small fingers were curled around a crumpled photograph, clutching it tightly even in sleep. Robert's first instinct was to call security and have the kid removed. He didn't do well with disruptions. His life was built on order, on control. But something made him pause. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the boy. The delicate features, the way his brow furrowed slightly even in rest, as if the world had already put too much weight on his small shoulders. He exhaled slowly, shaking off the ridiculous thought. It didn't matter who the kid resembled. What mattered was how the hell he got here. Before Robert could take another step, the boy stirred. His fingers tightened on the photograph as his eyes fluttered open, groggy, unfocused at first, before settling on Robert. And then, without hesitation, he sat up and said, "Are you my dad?" Robert froze. For the first time in years, he found himself utterly speechless. He blinked, convinced he had misheard. "What?" The boy rubbed his eyes with a small fist and yawned, as if this were the most casual question in the world. "Are you my dad?" he repeated, more alert now. His voice was small but firm, carrying the kind of certainty only a child could have. Robert's stomach tightened. The logical part of his brain, the part that had made him one of the most powerful men in the country, told him this was ridiculous. Impossible. He didn't have kids. He would have known if he did. "Who are you?" Robert asked instead, his voice sharper than intended. The boy hesitated, glancing down at the photograph in his hands before looking back up. "I'm Matteo," he said finally. "My mom told me that if I ever got lost, I should find you." Robert felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't some random lost child wandering into his office by mistake. This was intentional. His gaze flickered to the photograph, still partially obscured by Matteo's small fingers. He reached forward and gently took it from him. The image was old, the edges worn, but the moment it registered, the breath left his lungs. It was a picture of him. Him and Claire. Robert hadn't seen her in over a decade. He had spent years trying not to think about her, about the way she had disappeared from his life without a word, about the what-ifs that still crept up in the quiet hours of the night. And yet here she was, smiling back at him from the past, standing next to the man he used to be. His grip on the photo tightened. "Where is your mother?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more controlled. Matteo's expression changed. His small hands twisted in his hoodie, his feet swinging slightly off the couch. "She's gone," he said after a moment, eyes dropping to the floor. Robert's fingers flexed. Gone. The word rang in his head like an alarm, sharp and final. Before he could ask anything else, the door burst open. 2 security guards rushed in, their radios crackling, eyes already scanning the room for the intruder. "Sir, we got an alert." Matteo immediately tensed, his small body going rigid. Instinctively, he scooted closer to Robert, as if seeking protection from the two towering men. It was subtle, barely a movement, but Robert noticed. He lifted a hand, stopping the guards before they could grab the boy. "It's fine," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle this." The guards exchanged looks, clearly uncertain. No doubt they were wondering why their notoriously ruthless boss wasn't already throwing the kid out of his office. But Robert had built his empire on being unpredictable, and tonight was no exception. After a brief hesitation, the guards nodded and stepped back. Robert waited until the door clicked shut before turning back to Matteo. The boy was staring at him, cautious but hopeful, like he was waiting for Robert to decide whether he was safe here or not. Robert wasn't sure what to make of any of this. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Matteo couldn't be his son. He would have known. But Claire had sent him here, Claire, who had disappeared without a trace. And now, her son was sitting in his office, holding a photo of a life Robert had long buried. He should have felt frustrated, annoyed, maybe even angry. Instead, all he felt was a strange, nagging pull in his chest, something dangerously close to responsibility. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "All right, kid," he muttered. "Let's get some answers." Robert barely got a wink of sleep that night. He had sent Matteo to one of the guest rooms in his penthouse, but the boy's words kept circling in his mind. "Are you my dad?" He had never imagined hearing those words, let alone from a kid holding an old photograph of him and Claire. His instincts told him there was something bigger at play here, something Claire had never told him. And now, she was gone, and all he had was a boy who had shown up out of nowhere, claiming to be looking for him. By the time morning came, Robert was still struggling to make sense of it all. He walked into his office earlier than usual, coffee in hand, only to stop short at the sight that awaited him. Matteo was already wide awake, sitting in his oversized office chair, legs dangling, spinning himself in slow circles. Robert's sleek, minimalist workspace had been thoroughly disrupted. His normally pristine desk was now cluttered with chocolate wrappers, an empty coffee mug, and Robert narrowed his eyes. Was that his Mont Blanc pen? Matteo paused mid-spin and grinned at him. "Morning!" Robert inhaled sharply, setting his coffee down. "What are you doing?" "Making myself comfortable," Matteo said casually, popping another piece of chocolate into his mouth. "You had these fancy chocolates in your drawer, so I figured you wouldn't mind sharing." Robert pinched the bridge of his nose. "Those chocolates were imported from Belgium. They cost more than your sneakers." Matteo shrugged. "They taste like regular chocolate." Before Robert could respond, the door swung open, and Margot stormed in, heels clicking against the floor with her usual no-nonsense efficiency. His assistant had been working for him for years, long enough to know when something unusual was happening. And this was definitely unusual. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, eyes flicking between Robert and Matteo. "Why do we have a child in the office, eating your overpriced candy and spinning in your chair like he owns the place?" Matteo leaned back, giving her an easygoing wave. "Hey, I'm Matteo." Margot didn't look impressed. She turned back to Robert, arms crossed. "Sir?" Robert exhaled slowly. "It's complicated." He glanced at Matteo, then back at Margot. "He says his mother told him to find me." "His mother?" He hesitated, feeling the weight of the words before finally saying them. "His mother was Claire." Margot's brows lifted in surprise. "Claire? As in the Claire?" Robert gave a short nod. Margot had been around long enough to remember. She had seen how Claire's sudden disappearance had changed him, though Robert had never admitted how much it had hurt. Margot turned to Matteo, her sharp gaze softening slightly. "And what exactly are you doing here, kid?" Matteo swung his legs under the desk. "Like I told him," he said, jerking his head toward Robert. "Mom said if I ever got lost, I should find Robert Pattinson." He hesitated before adding, "She talked about him a lot." Robert felt something in his chest tighten. He had spent so long convincing himself Claire had left him without a second thought. But now, here was her son, her son, claiming she had talked about him. Talked about me how? He asked before he could stop himself. Mateo shrugged. Just that you were important. That you used to be someone she cared about. He scratched at the sleeve of his hoodie. She never told me why you weren't around. Robert's stomach twisted. He looked at Margot, wordlessly signaling her to do what she did best, find answers. She nodded, already pulling out her phone as she strode out of the office. In the silence that followed, Robert took a slow breath, staring at Mateo. He had too many questions and not nearly enough patience for the kid's easygoing attitude. But before he could press further, Mateo's attention drifted to Robert's laptop, which was open on his desk. Whoa, Mateo said, eyes lighting up. Is this your computer? This thing looks expensive. Robert frowned. Don't touch it. Too late. Mateo's fingers were already tapping at the keyboard, his curiosity far outweighing any sense of caution. Robert lunged forward, but just as he reached for the laptop, Mateo hit a key and... Oh, Mateo murmured, tilting his head. Oops. Robert glanced at the screen. His stomach dropped. An email had just been sent out to every single one of his investors. Mateo gave him a sheepish look. That wasn't supposed to happen. Robert's jaw clenched. He grabbed the laptop, reading the damage. The subject line? Super important business things. The body of the email? A string of emojis. Lots of them. Including a pizza, a rocket ship, and what appeared to be a very enthusiastic thumbs up. Robert closed his eyes for a long moment. I can explain, Mateo said quickly. Robert exhaled through his nose. I highly doubt that. Margot stormed back in, phone in hand, but stopped short at the tension in the room. She took one look at Robert's face, then at Mateo, and let out a weary sigh. What did he do? Robert turned the laptop around. Margot squinted at the screen. Then, to Robert's absolute horror, she burst out laughing. Robert glared. It's not funny. Oh no, it's hilarious, Margot corrected, pressing a hand to her forehead. Half of your investors are probably having a stroke right now. Mateo at least had the decency to look guilty. I thought I was just closing a window. You shouldn't leave important stuff open like that. Robert stared at him. Are you seriously lecturing me right now? Mateo gave a small shrug. Just saying, might be a security risk. Margot was still chuckling as she typed away on her phone. I'll do damage control. Though honestly, some of them could probably use a little humor in their lives. Robert pinched the bridge of his nose. This kid is going to be the death of me. Mateo grinned. That means you're not kicking me out yet, right? Robert paused. He should. He knew he should. But something about this boy, about the way he had looked at that photo, the way he had spoken about Claire, made it impossible for Robert to push him away just yet. Instead, he shook his head and muttered, Not yet. Mateo pumped a fist in the air. Yes. Robert sighed. What the hell am I getting myself into? Robert spent the rest of the morning trying to clean up the mess Mateo had made with his accidental email blast. But if he was being honest, his mind was elsewhere. The boy's presence in his office, the photograph, and the implications of Claire's connection to it all had unsettled something deep within him. He hadn't thought about her in years, had made a point not to, but now she was back in the form of a scrappy, chocolate-stealing kid with too many questions and an infuriating lack of fear. Margot returned just before noon, her expression grim as she walked in, closing the office door behind her. Robert already knew, just from the way she looked at him, that he wasn't going to like what she had to say. Mateo, oblivious to the tension in the room, was flipping through an old finance magazine on Robert's desk, making faces at the stock graphs like they personally offended him. Margot hesitated before speaking, her voice quieter than usual. I found out what happened to Claire. She glanced briefly at Mateo, then back at Robert, as if debating whether she should say it in front of him. Robert straightened in his chair. Just tell me. Margot nodded and took a breath. She passed away last year. Some kind of illness, cancer, from what I could find. She kept a low profile, no major records, nothing in the news. Just gone. Robert felt something in his chest tighten, an invisible fist squeezing around his ribs. Claire gone. The word didn't feel real, like it belonged to someone else's life, someone else's past. But it was his past. He thought he had buried those feelings long ago, convinced himself that she had left him behind without a second thought. And now, he would never have the chance to ask her why. Mateo, who had been silent during Margot's explanation, suddenly spoke. "I knew she was sick," he said, voice quiet, hands gripping the edges of the magazine a little too tightly. "She didn't talk about it much, though. Just said she wanted me to be okay." Robert watched as Mateo reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small, silver locket. His fingers curled around it, holding it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Robert swallowed hard. "Did she ever mention me?" Mateo nodded, though he kept his eyes down. "She said you were someone special?" His thumb ran over the surface of the locket absently, as if it were a habit, something he had done 1,000 times. "She didn't tell me a lot. Just that you were important once." Robert wasn't sure why that hit him so hard, but it did. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Mateo, at the kid who had walked into his life less than 24 hours ago and managed to shake him more than any business deal or corporate crisis ever could. Had Claire been hiding him? Had she known and chosen not to tell him? And if so, why? His thoughts were spiraling, and he needed a distraction. He needed air. More than anything, he needed more information. "Come on," he said abruptly, standing up. "Let's go get lunch." Mateo perked up immediately. "Oh, so now you feed me?" Robert shot him a dry look. "I let you eat half my chocolate this morning. Consider that an appetizer." Margot smirked as Robert grabbed his coat, nudging him slightly as he passed. "You know, you're actually kind of good at this," she teased under her breath. Robert gave her a flat look. "Don't push it." They took the company car, sleek and black with tinted windows, but Mateo spent the entire ride staring at the passing cityscape with his nose almost pressed to the glass. When they pulled up in front of an upscale restaurant Robert frequented, Mateo made a face before they even got out of the car. "Ugh," he muttered. "This place looks fancy." Robert arched an eyebrow. "That's because it is fancy," Mateo groaned. "Do they serve normal food? Define normal." Mateo folded his arms. "Burgers. Fries. Milkshakes." Robert sighed. He had spent the last decade dining on meals that were served on plates he could never pronounce, and drinking wine that cost more than most people's rent. He hadn't eaten at a cheap diner in years. But something about the way Mateo scrunched up his face at the idea of sitting in a restaurant where the waiters wore suits made him give in far too easily. "Fine," he muttered. "Pick a place." Mateo lit up. "Really?" Robert glanced down at him. "You're pushing your luck, kid." They ended up at a hole-in-the-wall diner with red vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't been updated in probably a decade. Mateo was practically bouncing in his seat as he ordered a cheeseburger, a massive plate of fries, and a chocolate milkshake. Robert ordered black coffee and a burger, feeling wildly out of place in his tailored suit surrounded by people in jeans and hoodies. Mateo, meanwhile, was completely in his element. "See?" he said around a mouthful of fries. "This is real food." Robert sipped his coffee, watching him. "I take it your mom brought you to places like this a lot?" Mateo nodded. "Yeah. She said fancy places make people forget what good food is." He grinned. "She'd hate that restaurant you tried to take me to." Robert smirked. "I liked her taste in some things." He paused, staring down at his coffee before asking the question he had been avoiding since last night. "Mateo, did she ever say why she didn't tell me about you?" Mateo's chewing slowed. He swallowed his bite, suddenly looking smaller in his seat. "Not really," he admitted. "She just said that things didn't work out. That you had a different life." Robert's jaw tensed. It wasn't enough of an answer. Not even close. Matteo fidgeted with the straw in his milkshake, then looked up at Robert, his expression unusually serious. Did you love my mom? Robert felt his throat tighten. He hadn't been prepared for that. Of all the questions Matteo could have asked, that was the one that caught him completely off guard. He could still picture Claire, her laugh, the way she used to roll her eyes at him but smile right after, the way she used to rest her head against his shoulder when she was tired, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He had loved her once. Maybe, in some way, he had never really stopped. But he didn't know how to explain that to a 10-year-old. Instead, he cleared his throat and picked up his coffee, keeping his voice neutral. Your mom was someone very special to me. Matteo studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to believe him. Then he just nodded, stealing another handful of fries. Yeah, he said quietly. I think she thought you were special too. Robert had no idea why those words hit him so hard. But they did. Robert barely spoke on the drive back from the diner. He wasn't sure what to say. Matteo, for all his usual chatter, seemed equally lost in thought, staring out the window with his half-finished milkshake still clutched in his hands. The question had caught Robert off guard, "Did you love my mom?" And his own answer had felt both true and insufficient. Love. He had loved Claire once, in a way that had felt all-consuming, in a way that made him believe he'd never love anyone else the same way again. But love hadn't been enough to keep them together, and now she was gone, leaving behind a boy with her same stubborn eyes and too many questions Robert didn't have the answers to. He pulled himself out of his thoughts as the car rolled to a stop in front of his building. The penthouse. The absurdly expensive, oversized apartment that had never really felt like home. It was the result of years of relentless ambition, a symbol of everything he had built, but somehow, looking at it now, he couldn't help but feel like a kid wouldn't belong there. Matteo, however, had no such reservations. The second they stepped inside, he let out a low whistle, his eyes sweeping over the impossibly high ceilings and the sleek, modern furniture. Whoa, he said, turning in a slow circle. This is so boring. Robert blinked. Excuse me? Matteo pointed to the pristine white walls, the minimalist decor, the expensive artwork that Robert had never actually looked at. This is like a rich guy cave. No color. No personality. Do you even live here? Robert sighed, setting his keys on the counter. I work. I sleep. That's about it. Matteo wrinkled his nose. Sounds depressing. Robert ignored him and pulled out his phone instead. I'm ordering a DNA test, he said, more to himself than to Matteo. We need to know for sure. Matteo shrugged, unbothered. Okay. But I already know. Robert glanced at him. Know what? Matteo grinned, tapping his own cheek. We have the same grumpy face. I saw it in the mirror this morning. Robert ran a hand down his face. This kid was going to kill him. The DNA test was ordered, and for the next several days, Robert found himself in an odd, reluctant routine with Matteo. At first, he thought about setting strict rules, no touching anything, no making a mess, no getting in his way, but he quickly realized those rules were pointless. Matteo never stayed in one place. He explored the penthouse like it was some kind of alien landscape, poking at things, inspecting Robert's bookshelves, and much to Robert's horror, digging through his fridge. Do you only eat weird expensive food? Matteo had asked, holding up a container of organic hummus like it personally offended him. Robert had sighed, rubbing his temple. I have regular food. Yeah? Where? Robert had opened his mouth, then realized he couldn't actually name anything in his fridge that Matteo would consider normal. The kid had just shaken his head and muttered, Tragic. But it wasn't the constant moving or questioning that tested Robert's patience the most, it was the drawings. Matteo loved to draw. And not just anything, he kept sneaking into Robert's office and leaving little sketches on his desk. Pictures of himself, pictures of Robert, sometimes even little cartoon versions of them both, standing side by side with exaggerated grumpy expressions. And every single drawing had one thing in common: they were always a family. One afternoon, after a long meeting at work, Robert returned home to find Matteo curled up on the couch, completely engrossed in cartoons. He had meant to ignore him, to head straight to his office, but the second Matteo spotted him, he scooted over and patted the empty space beside him. "Sit." Robert arched a brow. "No." Matteo patted the couch again, undeterred. "Come on. One episode. You look like you need it." Robert sighed, knowing he was too tired to argue. He sat down stiffly, prepared to endure the next 20 minutes, but something unexpected happened. The show was ridiculous, animated animals running around, causing chaos. But Matteo laughed so hard he nearly fell off the couch, and despite himself, despite everything, Robert smiled. And then, before he knew it, he laughed. A real laugh. The kind he hadn't let himself have in years. Matteo grinned, triumphant. "Knew you had it in you." Robert just shook his head. "You are the most exhausting person I've ever met." "Thank you," Matteo said proudly. The days passed, and despite Robert's initial reluctance, he found himself adjusting to Matteo's presence in ways he hadn't expected. He learned that Matteo hated waking up early but loved pancakes. That he had a weird habit of tapping his foot when he was thinking too hard. That he talked way too much during movies but somehow made it entertaining. It wasn't until one night, when Robert walked into his office late, that he realized just how much Matteo had wormed his way into his life. A fresh drawing sat on his desk. This one was different. It wasn't just Matteo and Robert. It was Claire too. She stood between them, holding both their hands, smiling softly. Above their heads, in wobbly handwriting, Matteo had written, "Mom's Family." Robert stared at it for a long time. The next morning, the DNA test results arrived. He hesitated before opening them, as if some part of him already knew the answer. And maybe he did. Maybe he had known the moment Matteo had walked into his office, clutching that old photograph. The paper in his hands confirmed it. Matteo was his son. Robert set the results down carefully, staring at the boy sitting at his kitchen counter, happily devouring a plate of pancakes like he had always belonged there. And maybe, just maybe, he did. Robert sat in his office, the DNA test results still sitting on his desk like a bomb waiting to go off. He had read them 3 times, each word etching itself deeper into his brain. Matteo is your son. There was no room for doubt. No loopholes. No way to convince himself this was some strange misunderstanding. Claire had never told him, had kept this part of her life hidden from him, and now she was gone, leaving him with a son he had never even known existed. His son. The words felt foreign. Heavy. He wasn't meant to be a father. He had barely managed to build a life for himself, let alone someone else. What the hell was he supposed to do with a 10-year-old boy who ate all his expensive chocolate and criticized his interior design? He had spent years perfecting a life of control. He dictated terms, signed deals, and shaped entire industries with a single decision. But this? Fatherhood wasn't something he could strategize his way through. Panic settled in, cold and creeping. His first instinct was to find a way out. Not entirely. He wouldn't abandon Matteo, of course, but there had to be a solution, something that made more sense than him raising a child. There were schools, world-renowned academies that specialized in children from unique circumstances. He could provide everything Matteo could ever need: education, security, a future, without appending his entire life. It made sense. He had almost convinced himself it was the best course of action when Margot stormed into his office and shattered that illusion within seconds. "Are you seriously considering shipping him off to some cold, sterile boarding school?" she demanded, arms crossed, her expression sharp enough to cut through his defenses. Robert exhaled slowly, not looking up from his desk. "It's what's best for him," Margot scoffed. "No, it's what's easiest for you." Robert's jaw tightened. "I don't know how to be a father. And you think throwing money at the problem is going to make it go away?" Margot snapped. "You can put him in the best school in the world, And it won't change the fact that he wants to be with you. He's already lost his mother. Do you really want to be the next person who makes him feel like he's not wanted? Robert flinched at that. He hated that she was right. Hated that she had managed to see through him so easily. Margot softened just slightly, her voice lowering. You're scared. I get it. But you can't buy your way out of this, Robert. The kid doesn't care about your money. He cares about you. And if you push him away now, you're going to regret it. Robert didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the DNA test, his mind a storm of doubt and fear. That night, long after Matteo had gone to bed, Robert found himself standing in the doorway of his room. The kid was curled up under a blanket that was far too big for him, his small hands still gripping the locket that had never left his possession. His face was peaceful, trusting in a way that made Robert's chest ache. What the hell was he doing? He had spent his entire life fighting for control, for success, for something bigger than himself. And yet, standing there in that doorway, watching his son sleep, he realized he had never felt more afraid of failure than he did in that moment. Because this wasn't business. This wasn't a game of power or strategy. This was a little boy who had already lost one parent, and Robert couldn't be the reason he lost another. He exhaled, running a hand down his face before finally stepping inside. He wasn't good at this. He didn't have the right words, didn't know what he was supposed to say. But he had to start somewhere. Hey, kid, he said softly. Matteo stirred, blinking sleepily before rubbing his eyes. MMPH, late. Robert hesitated for only a second before sitting on the edge of the bed. You're staying here. With me. Matteo blinked again, sitting up slightly. For how long? Robert's throat tightened. For now. There was a beat of silence, then Matteo grinned. A real, wide, relieved grin. So, forever? Robert sighed, shaking his head. Don't push it. Matteo flopped back onto his pillow, still grinning. Knew you wouldn't send me away. Robert arched a brow. You were that sure? Yup, Matteo said confidently. You like me too much. Robert snorted. Debatable. Matteo just smirked, eyes drooping again as sleep started pulling him back under. Robert sat there for a long time, watching him, trying to make peace with the fact that his life had just changed in a way he hadn't been prepared for. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to change it back. The next morning, Matteo was buzzing with energy. So, since I'm staying, he said over breakfast, I think we need to do something important. Robert, still nursing his coffee and trying to wake up, eyed him warily. Do I even want to know? Matteo nodded, completely serious. We need to build a pillow fort. Robert blinked. A what? A pillow fort, Matteo repeated, as if it were obvious. It's crucial. Essential. Every home needs one. Robert pinched the bridge of his nose. I run a billion-dollar company. Matteo gave him a look. And you can't build a fort? Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no rebuttal. Margot, passing by the kitchen, snorted into her coffee. Oh, you are so doomed. And somehow, 20 minutes later, Robert Pattinson, CEO, Billionaire, and one of the most powerful men in the country, found himself sitting on the floor of his massive penthouse, trying to construct a fort out of expensive pillows while Matteo critiqued his architecture skills. You can't just stack them like that, Matteo said, hands on his hips. There's no structural integrity. Robert shot him a flat look. Oh, so now you're an engineer? Yes, Matteo said confidently. And this is unacceptable. Robert shook his head but found himself grinning as they rebuilt the thing together, Matteo giving directions like it was a mission of national importance. It was ridiculous, completely absurd, and yet somehow, Robert didn't mind. Because for the first time in a long time, his home didn't feel empty. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth the chaos. Robert had negotiated multi-billion-dollar deals, handled ruthless corporate takeovers, and outmaneuvered some of the most cutthroat business minds in the world. And yet, none of that had prepared him for the chaos of raising a 10-year-old. The pillow fort incident had been just the beginning. He quickly learned that Mateo had the energy of a small hurricane and the stubbornness of a boardroom full of executives. The first few days were pure survival mode. Mateo had a million questions, never sat still, and treated Robert's penthouse like a theme park with unlimited access. Robert, who was used to structure, order, and quiet, felt like he had been thrown into the deep end of an Olympic-sized pool with bricks tied to his ankles. The solution? Hire professionals. Robert prided himself on efficiency, and if parenting was going to be part of his life, then surely there were experts who could help. Within 48 hours, he had a team of nannies, child psychologists, and educational consultants lined up, each one carefully vetted and highly qualified. Mateo fired every single one of them. The first nanny had been too serious. The second one was too old, Mateo's words, not Robert's. The third apparently smelled like weird soap. And the fourth? Well, that had been a disaster Robert would never forget. She had lasted exactly 1 hour before Mateo had locked her out of the apartment, barricading the door with dining chairs and informing Robert, very calmly, that this is a no-nanny household now. Robert had nearly lost his mind. Margot, of course, had found the entire situation hilarious. You're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and you're losing a power struggle to a 10-year-old, she had said, sipping her coffee with far too much amusement. Robert had glared at her. He mutinied. And you lost. Robert had grumbled under his breath, but deep down, he knew she was right. Mateo didn't want a nanny. He didn't want a carefully curated schedule or a team of professionals dictating his day. He wanted Robert. And that terrified him more than anything. The wake-up call came one morning when Robert, exhausted and sleep-deprived, shuffled into the kitchen to find Mateo sitting at the counter with his tablet, looking far too pleased with himself. Robert groaned and ran a hand through his hair. Why do I feel like something horrible just happened? Mateo grinned. Because it did. Robert stared at him, then at the tablet. He grabbed it, scrolling through the screen, and immediately froze. His face. His half-asleep, grumpy, unshaven morning face was currently being live-streamed to thousands of viewers. Mateo had somehow, accidentally started a live video conference with the company's investors. For 20 minutes. Robert could not believe what he was seeing. His inbox was already exploding with emails from confused and very amused board members. Margot had sent nothing but a single text. This is the greatest day of my life. Robert turned to Mateo, voice dangerously calm. How? Mateo shrugged, completely unbothered. You left your laptop open. I was trying to play Minecraft. That button looked important. Robert closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. You live-streamed me to the company's investors. Mateo tapped his chin. I think one guy tried to ask a question, but I just muted him. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it. There were no words. He had been brought to his knees by a 10-year-old. Margot, of course, was no help. When she showed up later that morning, she was still laughing. Honestly, you should just retire now. He's already won. Robert muttered something about rewriting his will out of pure spite before locking his laptop with security settings so intense that not even NASA could break in. After that, he finally accepted that he needed to be present in Mateo's life. Fully. No more outsourcing. No more avoidance. He had to step up. The opportunity presented itself when Mateo came home one day waving a flyer in the air. Big school event this Friday, Mateo announced, shoving the paper at Robert. Robert took it, reading over the details. An art showcase? Yep. And you have to come. Robert hesitated. He hadn't stepped foot in a school since he had been a student. His life revolved around conference rooms and board meetings, not PDA gatherings and art exhibits. But Mateo was watching him expectantly, and for once, Robert didn't have an excuse ready. So Friday evening he went. He had never felt more out of place in his life. The room was packed with kids, parents, and teachers, all gathered around makeshift displays of student artwork. Robert, dressed in his usual tailored suit, stood stiffly among them, resisting the urge to check his phone every 5 seconds. And then Matteo appeared, grinning from ear to ear. "Come on, you have to see mine!" Robert followed him to one of the displays, prepared to be unimpressed. But when Matteo pointed to his artwork, Robert's breath actually caught. It was a drawing. A terrible, wobbly, hilariously inaccurate drawing of him. Stick figure Robert had ridiculous eyebrows, a grumpy frown, and what appeared to be a briefcase the size of his entire body. Next to him stood Matteo, also a stick figure, but with a massive, beaming smile. Above them, in big, messy letters, Matteo had written, "Me and my dad." Robert stared at it for a long time. Longer than he meant to. His throat felt weirdly tight. "Do you like it?" Matteo asked, watching him carefully. Robert cleared his throat, forcing his voice to stay even. "It's something." Matteo grinned. "You love it." Robert exhaled, shaking his head. "It's getting framed." And it did. The next day, the stick figure drawing of "Me and my dad" was sitting on Robert's desk in his office, right where everyone could see it. Margot, passing by, stopped and stared. "Are you okay? Did you hit your head?" Robert sipped his coffee. "Shut up, Margot." She smirked, walking off. "Welcome to fatherhood, boss." Robert had finally started to feel like he was getting the hang of this fatherhood thing. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but the chaos that once felt overwhelming had started to become normal. He had learned to navigate Matteo's endless energy, his curiosity, his stubborn streak that mirrored Robert's own. Mornings were filled with burnt toast experiments and cereal debates. Evenings were spent with poorly built pillow forts and Matteo talking way too much during movies. And somehow, Robert liked it. He liked the way Matteo made his penthouse feel less like a museum and more like a home. He liked coming home to drawings scattered across his desk and finding his expensive suits covered in cookie crumbs. He even, though he never admitted it, liked the way Matteo challenged him, kept him on his toes. So when the knock came on his office door one afternoon, followed by Margot's unusually tense voice saying, "You're going to want to take this in private," Robert had no idea that everything was about to come crashing down. The woman standing in the hallway looked like she had stepped straight out of a courtroom. Tight posture, sharp eyes, the kind of stiff composure that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Robert didn't recognize her at first, but when she introduced herself, the weight of her name hit him like a gut punch. "Victoria Hale," she said, voice clipped businesslike. "Claire's sister." Robert stiffened. He had never met Claire's family. She had barely spoken about them, and from what little he knew, the relationship had been strained at best. And now, her sister, Matteo's aunt, was standing in front of him, not with condolences or memories to share, but with a demand. "I want custody of Matteo." Robert's grip tightened around the edge of his desk. "Excuse me?" Victoria folded her arms. "You're not his real father." Robert felt something cold settle in his chest. "The DNA test says otherwise." She exhaled sharply, as if his response was exactly what she had expected. "You might be his biological father, but you didn't even know he existed until a few weeks ago. Claire raised him. Our family raised him. And now you think you can just step in and play dad?" She shook her head. "That boy needs stability. Not some billionaire who barely knows what to do with him." Robert's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what to do with him. Do you?" Victoria shot back, arching a brow. "Because from what I hear, you're still figuring it out. Meanwhile, I've been in his life since the day he was born. And if Claire were still here, she wouldn't have left him with you." Robert's hands curled into fists. He didn't know what Claire would have wanted. He would never get the chance to ask her. But he knew Matteo. He knew the kid who had wormed his way into his life, the one who had drawn ridiculous stick-figure portraits of them, the one who had made himself at home in Robert's carefully controlled world. And now this woman, this stranger, thought she could just waltz in and take him away? "No," Robert said flatly. Victoria's expression hardened. You don't get to just say no. Yes, I do. You work 70 hours a week, she snapped. You're not cut out for this. Robert glared at her. That's not your call to make. Victoria sighed, pressing her lips together before her voice softened, almost like she was trying to be reasonable. I don't doubt that you care about him. But Matteo is family. My family. And I have lawyers who will make this official. You might be powerful, Robert, but you can't fight blood ties. Robert stared at her, heart pounding. He had fought corporations. He had fought ruthless businessmen who would stab their own partners in the back for a profit. But this was a fight he had never prepared for. And then he realized something even worse. Matteo had heard everything. The boy stood in the hallway, half hidden behind the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides, his face unreadable. Robert's stomach dropped. Victoria noticed too, straightening as she turned to him. Matteo, she said, voice suddenly gentle. I know this is a lot, but I just want what's best for you. Matteo didn't say anything. He just looked at Robert. And for the first time since they had met, Robert saw doubt in his eyes. Robert took a step toward him. Matteo, you don't have to pretend you want me, Matteo blurted out. His voice was small, barely above a whisper. If you don't want me to stay, just say it. Robert felt the words like a knife to the gut. That's not what this is. Matteo bit his lip, nodding a little too quickly. It's okay, he said, voice cracking. I get it. Then he turned and ran. Robert's heart pounded as he bolted after him, calling his name, but Matteo was fast. He disappeared into his room, and by the time Robert reached him, the kid was already throwing clothes into a small, worn backpack. Robert froze in the doorway, something in his chest fracturing at the sight. What are you doing? Matteo didn't look at him. Packing. Robert swallowed hard. You don't need to pack. Matteo's hands tightened around the zipper. Just tell me where I'm going. His voice was barely holding together. I'll go wherever you say. Robert had never been great at emotions. He had spent his whole life avoiding vulnerability, keeping his walls up. But right now, looking at the boy who had completely wrecked his carefully built world, he knew there was only one thing to do. He stepped forward, slowly, and knelt beside Matteo. I want you here, he said, voice raw. With me. Matteo's breath hitched. But she said I don't care what she said. Robert placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder, firm but gentle. You're my son. And I don't care what it takes, I'm keeping you. Matteo finally looked up at him, eyes filled with uncertainty, like he wanted so badly to believe him but didn't know if he should. I mean it, kid, Robert said, his voice softening. I want you here. Not because I have to. Because I want to. Matteo's lip wobbled. And then, in the next second, he dropped the backpack, launched himself forward, and threw his arms around Robert. Robert barely caught him before Matteo buried his face against his shoulder, his small frame shaking. Robert exhaled, closing his eyes as he held onto him, grounding them both. And for the first time in his life, Robert knew this was the fight that mattered. And he wasn't going to lose. The custody battle didn't last long. Robert had expected a war, long, drawn-out court hearings, lawyers slinging accusations, Victoria using every angle she could to take Matteo away from him. But in the end, the judge saw what mattered. Robert showed up. He didn't just throw money at the situation or rely on his name to sway the decision. He stood in that courtroom, hard on the line, and proved that he wasn't just some absent biological father trying to make up for lost time. He was Matteo's dad. Victoria had fought hard, but she couldn't argue against the evidence. She had been distant in Matteo's life, barely involved beyond the occasional holiday visit. Robert, in just a short time, had given Matteo more stability, more love, and more family than she had ever offered. And when the judge officially granted Robert full custody, he had felt something in his chest loosen, something he hadn't even realized he'd been holding on to. He had won. Not just in the legal sense, but in the way that actually mattered. Matteo was his now. Officially. The boy had barely waited until they got outside before tackling Robert in the tightest hug he had ever received. "Told you," Matteo had said into his shirt, voice muffled. "You like me too much." Robert had just rolled his eyes, but he hadn't let go. Things changed after that. Not in a dramatic, earth-shattering way, but in all the little ways that mattered. Robert adjusted his schedule, cutting down late meetings, working from home more often, making time for things that once would have seemed unimportant. But now, they weren't just important, they were everything. And despite his best efforts, Matteo had somehow turned into the unofficial mascot of Pattinson Enterprises. It started when Robert took him to a company event, a formal gala, full of polished investors and executives who all took themselves far too seriously. Robert had planned to keep Matteo on the sidelines, letting him enjoy the fancy food while staying out of trouble. That plan lasted exactly 20 minutes before Matteo found the microphone. Robert had been mid-conversation with an important investor when a small, familiar voice echoed through the ballroom speakers. "Hi everyone. My name's Matteo, and I just want to say something important." Robert turned in slow horror to see his 10-year-old son standing confidently at the podium, grinning out at hundreds of very rich, very serious business professionals. "My dad," Matteo continued, completely undeterred by the silence in the room, "is the best dad ever." Someone coughed. Another person snorted. Robert closed his eyes. "I'm never living this down. He used to be super boring." Matteo went on, as if that wasn't deeply damaging to Robert's corporate reputation. "But now he's actually kinda cool." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Robert sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Matteo beamed at him from the stage. "You're welcome," he said smugly when he finally returned to Robert's side. Robert muttered something about canceling his allowance, but the damage was already done. Everyone loved Matteo. For weeks after, executives and employees alike kept bringing it up, half teasing, half genuinely endeared by the sight of their famously icy CEO being reduced to just a dad in front of a room full of people. And honestly, Robert didn't mind. Matteo had become his world in ways he never expected. He taught the kid how to tie a tie, an absolute disaster at first, considering Matteo nearly strangled himself with the knot. In return, Matteo tried to teach Robert how to be cool, which, according to him, meant wearing baseball caps backward and learning dad jokes. Neither lesson was particularly successful. "You're hopeless," Matteo groaned one afternoon, dramatically flopping onto the couch. Robert, flipping through the fifth baseball cap Matteo had tried to make him wear, smirked. "Says the kid who still can't tie a double Windsor." Matteo shot him a look. "That's not my fault. Ties are evil." Robert just ruffled his hair, ignoring the boy's half-hearted protests. Then, one afternoon, Robert took Matteo somewhere special. A quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town, where a single headstone marked a life that had ended too soon. Claire. Matteo had been quiet the whole ride there, his usual energy dimmed by the weight of where they were going. When they reached the grave, Robert gave him space, watching as the boy traced his fingers over the carved letters of his mother's name. "She would have liked you," Matteo said after a long silence. "I mean, she did like you. But she would have liked you now." Robert swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah?" Matteo nodded. "Yeah. You're not so bad anymore." Robert huffed a quiet laugh. "High praise." Matteo smiled a little, then tilted his head up at him. "You think she'd be happy?" Robert didn't hesitate. "I know she would." Matteo took a deep breath, then set down a small bouquet of flowers, ones he had picked himself. Robert stood beside him, feeling the weight of everything unsaid, of the years lost, of the memories they would never get back. But when Matteo slipped his small hand into his, squeezing just slightly, Robert knew that this moment, this boy, was what mattered now. The next day, Robert had one last surprise. Matteo had no idea where they were going. He kept bouncing in his seat, firing off wild guesses, none of which were even close. When they finally arrived, his jaw dropped. A treehouse. Not just any treehouse, the treehouse. The one Claire had always dreamed of as a kid. The one she had told Robert about years ago, back when they were young and thought the future was limitless. He had never forgotten. And now, standing in front of it, Matteo's eyes wide with wonder, Robert knew it had been the right thing to do. "You built this?" Matteo asked, voice full of awe. Robert smirked. "Well, I paid people to build it. But yeah." Matteo turned to him, expression serious. "That counts." Then he grinned, the kind of grin that made Robert's chest ache in the best way. "It's perfect," Matteo said. "Just like a real family." Robert felt something settle in him, something deep and unshakable. He reached out, ruffling Matteo's hair as the boy laughed, ducking away. "That's because we are one," Robert said, voice softer than usual. Matteo's grin widened, and before Robert knew it, the kid was already climbing up the ladder, calling for him to hurry up. And so, for the first time in years, Robert let go. He followed Matteo up, laughter echoing through the trees, knowing that this messy, chaotic, wonderful life was exactly where he was meant to be. Robert sat on the wooden floor of the treehouse, leaning against one of the sturdy beams as he listened to Matteo excitedly plan all the adventures they were going to have up there. The kid was already talking about secret passwords, club rules, and how they needed a sign that said, "No boring business stuff allowed." A rule Robert was fairly certain was directly aimed at him. He let Matteo ramble, watching the way his face lit up, his hands moving animatedly as he talked. It was moments like this that made Robert realize just how much had changed in such a short time. A few months ago, he had been a man who lived for his work, who measured his life in profits and strategic victories. He had built walls so high that no one, not even himself, could see over them. And then a 10-year-old had walked into his office, armed with a crumpled photograph and a question that had wrecked everything Robert thought he knew about himself. "Are you my dad?" At the time, he hadn't known the answer. He hadn't known if he could be a father, if he deserved to be one. But now, sitting here, watching Matteo ramble about treehouse rules and how they needed a snack stash up there, he knew the truth. He was a father. Not just in the biological sense, not just because of a DNA test, but because of everything that had happened since. Because of every decision he had made to keep Matteo close instead of pushing him away. Because of the way he had learned to laugh again, to care, to put someone else above everything else. He had spent years thinking he had lost his chance at happiness. That Claire had walked away and taken something irreplaceable with her. That his life would always be a series of meetings and mergers, a relentless pursuit of something he could never quite name. But now he knew this was what he had been searching for all along. A family. A home. Matteo. The boy suddenly flopped down next to him, stretching out with a content sigh. "I've decided," he announced. Robert raised an eyebrow. "That's dangerous." Matteo ignored him. "This is the best treehouse in the world." Robert smirked. "I should hope so. It cost enough." Matteo turned his head, frowning slightly. "You know that's not why it's the best, right?" Robert blinked, caught off guard by the seriousness in his tone. "Oh?" Matteo hesitated, then shrugged, fiddling with a loose thread on his sleeve. "It's the best because it's ours." Robert felt something in his chest tighten. He didn't say anything at first, just reached over and ruffled Matteo's hair, making the boy squawk in protest. "You're such a sap," Robert muttered. Matteo grinned. "Yeah, but I learned from the best." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "I was never a sap before you showed up." Matteo gave him a smug look. "Exactly." Robert sighed, rolling his eyes, but he couldn't hide the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The sun had started to dip below the trees, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, the world quiet except for the distant hum of life below them. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Robert felt at peace. Matteo yawned, stretching his arms above his head before leaning against Robert's side, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Robert hesitated for only a moment before wrapping an arm around him, pulling him close. For years, he had believed that love, the real kind, the kind that changed you, was something that had slipped through his fingers a long time ago. That it had belonged to a past he could never get back. But sitting here, in a treehouse he had built for his son, he finally understood. Love hadn't been lost. It had just been waiting for him to find it again. And he had. In a little boy who had walked into his life and refused to leave. In a home that no longer felt empty. In a future that, for the first time, wasn't just his own. Matteo let out a sleepy sigh, his voice muffled against Robert's shoulder. Told you we were a real family. Robert looked down at him, his heart full in a way he hadn't even known was possible. Yeah, he murmured, pressing a rare, soft kiss to Matteo's messy hair. You did. And as laughter echoed through the trees, as the sky darkened into twilight, Robert knew this was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.